As you can see, this meeting is being recorded. So while we hope that you'll all be willing to have your cameras on, by all means, if you'd prefer the privacy of not, well, frankly, there's no way for us to stop you. So just be advised that this is being recorded. I also want to mention, as a matter of pure logistics, I think we've got everything officially straightened out with the weather and Dr. Lepiarvi's flight out of Cleveland, but we've had some little issues with that, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on my email and my phone in case there's any new developments on that front. So if I disappear, I can pretty much guarantee that that's the reason why. But let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, and then I'll let him take over. Oh, and I'll need to make him the presenter at some point. Jason, I haven't forgotten that. So I had the chance a few years ago to meet our guest speaker. Some of you who know me know that I have a long-standing interest in a group of authors called the Inklings, which was a fairly large group, depending on how you slice it. But by far, the two most famous members of that group were C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And I suspect that most of you have heard those names before. And when I was working as a professor at a university in Alabama, I would teach classes on the Inklings, and we would occasionally take study abroad trips over to Oxford, England, where the Inklings used to meet regularly. And on one of our trips there, I had been looking for an opportunity to have my students hear from experts on these authors and these thinkers. And one of the scholars that I already knew said, "Hey, you should meet this guy called Jason Lepiarvi. He's amazing. He's brilliant. He's teaching with us here at Oxford for a year or two." I said, "Okay, sure, we'll give him a shot." And I asked him to speak to my students. He was very gracious in doing so, and he was brilliant. Really loved hearing from him. And then I saw just a few months ago that he was going to be kind of sort of in the Detroit area. And I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, Cleveland's not too far. Is there any way that you'd be willing to come by this way and maybe give a talk to our philosophy club, as long as, you're just a couple of hours away?" So long story short, that's what leads us to today, which was supposed to be an event at the Mandel Center. But I'm really pleased to see so many people showing up on a snow day and being a part of this conversation. Thanks for doing it remotely. And now let me introduce our speaker more properly. Born to a Canadian mother and a Finnish father, Dr. Jason Lepiarvi obtained a PhD in theology at the University of Helsinki. His dissertation, "God is Love, but Love is Not God," analyzed the brilliance and the blind spots in C.S. Lewis's ideas of love. At Oxford, Dr. Lepiarvi served as the Junior Research Fellow in Theology at St. Benet's Hall and the president of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society. Presently, he's a fellow of Thorneloe University in Ontario, Canada, where he has taught a number of courses on the Inklings. Dr. Lepiarvi continues to offer Oxford-style tutorials through his website studycslewis.com. He is married and has 3 small children, and he is in my house right now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Lepiarvi. There's some hands. Thank you. And Jason, let me make you the presenter, and then it'll be your show here.
I seem to have the sharing rights, so all is good.
Oh, good.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I was looking forward to speaking and seeing you all in person, maybe next time. So a couple of days ago, yesterday, we drove for 4 hours from the Detroit area so that I could speak to you through video from Hudson. So it sounds odd, but I made an effort to speak to you from Dr. Jordan's guest bedroom. Let me try and share my screen. How does that look? Is it working? Perfect. The philosophy of enemy love, something that I've been thinking about lately. So I'll be sharing with you some thoughts that are still evolving thoughts, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you think. and perhaps you can even help me strengthen my ideas. Dr. Jordan, if you have the handout and wouldn't mind sharing it in the chat, just in case somebody doesn't have it, I'd be grateful.
I will do that. It'll take me a second to get a link to it, but just keep an eye on the chat, everybody. If you didn't get the handout in an email earlier today, you'll have it in just a moment.
So C.S. Lewis, whom Dr. Jordan mentioned, was an Oxford professor of English, and he was famous for his books on the Chronicles of Narnia, which were made into big Hollywood blockbusters not too long ago. But he was also a First World War veteran who landed in the trenches on his 19th birthday, was seriously wounded by friendly fire when a British shell fell into his trench, decimating his friend next to him and seriously injuring himself. During the Second World War, he was too old for active service, but he traveled around Britain speaking to Royal Air Force pilots, so both fighter pilots and bomber pilots, to boost their morale. And why did he choose the Royal Air Force? It was because these young men had the shortest life expectancy. That's why. Now, during this Second World War, he did a lot of thinking about enemy love, how to love our enemies or people who piss us off, excuse my language. The dictator of the Soviet Union, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Stalin, or as Lewis sometimes called him, and I think North Americans did as well, Uncle Joe. Joseph Stalin, or Uncle Joe, seemed particularly unlovable or hard to love. And this is what Lewis says to a friend in one of his letters. I pray every night for the people I am most tempted to hate or despise. The present list is Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Mackenzie, Austin, and Opie. The last three, which you won't recognize, were his college professor colleagues. And in the effort to make this real, I've had to do a good deal of thinking. Note, I don't mean that I'm tempted to hate them equally, of course. Now, I think we can learn quite a bit from Lewis's great deal of thinking. There's nothing special in Lewis himself, and we could approach this idea of enemy love through the lens of some other author, but it sometimes helps to choose someone who articulates their ideas well, so that then you can assess them. It makes it easier for you to come up with your own ideas and thoughts and opinion. Most of Lewis's thoughts were on the nature and the limits of enemy love were expressed in essays and in books and letters during the Second World War. And they're not free of the occasional blind spots, but they're always interesting and they're sometimes quite startling. Consider, for example, his description of war as an odious necessity. Sometimes necessary, but still odious. Terrible. Or consider his optimistic belief that if he, and this quote is in your handout at the top, if he and a German soldier had killed each other simultaneously and met right after death, he says, I cannot imagine that either one of us would have felt any resentment or even any embarrassment. I think we might have laughed over it. Now, if Lewis, who had fought in one world war and survived or lived through another, felt ill-qualified to speak or comment on certain issues, including war, the same applies triply to me. I'm a Finnish Canadian, and we share a really long border with a whimsical neighbor, and I'll let you infer which one. Like all Finnish men, I've undergone mandatory military training. But I have no experience of non-simulated combat, which is a tougher way of saying that I don't have combat experience. But my father and I are trained combat medics. My father, for religious reasons, served unarmed. I didn't. But enemy love is much more than just military ethics, and I'm also a trained ethicist and a philosopher, so perhaps you'll allow me to ask and at least um, attempt to answer two very difficult questions about enemy love, with Lewis as my guide. The first of which is, how do we forgive a person who has deeply injured us? This sounds really difficult. The second has been called the dilemma of the Christian soldier, which is how to reconcile this biblical commandment to love your enemy with the military task of defeating and, when necessary, killing your enemy. Can I love my enemy and kill him? Now, this sounds downright impossible. Well, first we need to define our words. It's impossible to solve the problem of enemy love before we define the terms enemy and love. And as so often happens, when you define words carefully, you almost answer your own question. So let's start with love. This is what I understand love to be. Love is the appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing or well-being, insofar as possible and permissible. Regardless of what kind of love we talk about, whether it's romance or friendship or whatnot, this is the common denominator. This is what all forms of love share in common, in my view. So I'm going to run with this. And it's a virtue, and it has three elements: the attitudinal, the practical, and the relational. It follows that any kind of human relationship can be promoted to a love relationship when we can turn to the other, regardless of who they are, and say, even if we say it silently, that it's good that you exist. I will involve myself in your well-being insofar as I can, and I welcome your love in return. So this is what I love you means. And this is why enemy love is so difficult. Try saying that, even mentally, to the difficult person in your life. It's good that you exist. No, it's not good that you exist. It's terrible that you exist. That's why enemy love is so difficult. So that's love, in my view. So what then is an enemy? Who's my enemy? And what makes them my enemy? A couple of distinctions will help. Now, in Judeo-Christian vocabulary, everyone is our neighbor, quote unquote, but some neighbors are easier to love than others. And so we may loosely distinguish between so-called easy neighbors and difficult neighbors. Both groups are spectrums. The difficult spectrum is well on display in C.S. Lewis's book called The Four Loves, where Lewis speaks of lepers, criminals, enemies, morons, the sulky, the superior, and the sneering. Note that it's difficult to love these difficult neighbors for very different reasons. Enemies are obviously in the difficult camp, but not all difficult neighbors are enemies. Not every moron is your enemy. Why this is important for us is that where they are on this spectrum affects and can sometimes limit the way in which we can love them. How we love depends on where they are. And so we must make another distinction, that between a difficult neighbor and an enemy neighbor. An enemy neighbor is a difficult neighbor whom it is difficult to love for a specific reason. What is that reason? And I propose there are two: resentment and injury. Your enemy, then, is any person whom you find difficult to love because either you feel resentment towards them or they seek to injure you or someone you love. Both reasons don't have to apply together at once. You may resent a person for other reasons than injury, and you may, if you're a saint, not always feel ill will towards people who labor against you. But sometimes both reasons apply together. Resentment follows hurt. Often the very reason you're resentful is a preceding or a looming injury of some sort. Often, but not always, the enemy is the most difficult person to love. And you remember the 6 people at the very beginning that Lewis listed that he was most tempted to hate or despise. 3 dictators and 3 colleagues. And then he clarified that he was, of course, not tempted to hate them equally. And if that made any of you smile, it was probably because we assumed, at least I assumed, and I think that Lewis probably assumed and meant to say that, say, loving Stalin or Hitler was more difficult than loving, say, his difficult colleagues at college. But I suggest that in reality this might not have been so. Foreign tyrants can be mythical abstractions, and the real terrorists are domestic. College cancel culture is not a recent phenomenon. Incidentally, in his very next letter to the same person, he says that, and he confesses rather sheepishly that despite this real bloody war going on in Europe in his neighborhood at the moment, his job at Oxford University is, quote, in one way even nicer, for some of those whom I liked least in college have gone away to work in government departments and one in America. And the one who went to America was actually listed in that list of 6 people. By defining first love and enemy, we've, as a happy byproduct, discovered the essence of enemy love as well. It is this. Enemy love is the appreciative and responsive commitment, insofar as possible, to the well-being of people you feel resentment towards and have injured you or seek to injure you. This is the definition of enemy love that I've adopted, and we'll see what comes of it. For people who are Christians like Lewis himself, what makes it difficult that it's absolutely mandatory, it's compulsory, like masks. It's even more important than face masks. Love your enemies, commanded Jesus. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. By loving the good sinner doesn't mean condoning or excusing their bad sin. This is the wrong way to deal with bullies, whether at work or at war. You don't have to like your enemy either. Just like the virtue of love in general, to love, the love which is practiced towards enemies is not an involuntary sentiment or an emotion, or it couldn't be commanded. So obviously it's something beyond emotion. Knowing what love is not, love is not liking someone necessarily, makes the task of loving difficult neighbors and especially loving enemies a lot easier. In one way, the most accurate but boring answer to the question, how must we love our enemies, is just to roll out the elements that were embedded in our definition. You love your enemy by appreciatively and responsively committing to their well-being insofar as you can. And enemy love means wisely looking for opportunities to demonstrate to whatever extent is possible. And such opportunities are actually endless, and it would be rather tedious to go through examples. So I'll ask something else instead. I'll ask, how can we make enemy love easier? Love in general is made easier by practicing all of the virtues, which are good habits and qualities, virtues that inform and protect love. For example, you can't be a very loving person if you're not also courageous. And you can't be a very loving person or spouse or partner if you're not also faithful, and so on. So all virtues, good qualities somehow contribute and support and protect and give love power. Enemy love is made easier above all by a key virtue that tackles the first of the two challenges imposed by the enemy relation. And the two challenges were resentment and violence, I proposed. So let's look at resentment first. This is the evil, resentment, that Lewis wanted to avoid in his own heart by practicing enemy love. He often talks about resentment and hate interchangeably. He tells his friend, "We all know the perilous charm of a shared hatred or grievance." Hatred means to cherish resentment, to gloat over another's misery, to delight in injuring him or them. What causes such hatred and resentment in our heart? Well, usually injury does, whether it's emotional or physical. Resentment, Lewis says, means to chew over and over the cud of some injury, to dwell in a kind of self-torture on every circumstance that aggravates it. Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. In this sense, resentment is anti-forgiveness and as such an obstacle to enemy love, which is another way of saying that forgiveness is anti-resentment and as such the key supporting virtue of enemy love. Forgiveness is. In Lewis's mind, enemy love and forgiveness are almost synonymous. Forgiveness is the very first thing that comes to his mind when he thinks of enemy love. He says, "It is laid down in the Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Because in Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy, and so we come up against this terrible duty of forgiving our enemies." Terrible duty. And it's terrible for three reasons, the last of which is the worst. First of all forgiveness, but especially forgiveness of enemies, is terrible because it's so damn difficult. It's the most unpopular of the Christian virtues, according to Lewis, even more distasteful than chastity, if you can believe it. The second reason it's terrible, forgiveness is terrible, is that for Christians at least, it's a religious duty. Forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. As we forgive those who trespass against us, as God in Christ forgave you. And this is perhaps the hardest pill to swallow, the third and last reason why forgiveness is terrible. Not only is forgiveness difficult and a duty, our own forgiveness, so he thought, is predicated on forgiving others. At least that's what he believed. And he says, it's made perfectly clear that if we don't forgive, we shall not be forgiven. The upside of duty and conditionality, however terrible, is that they provide a tremendous source of motivation to forgive. So how do we forgive? What does forgiveness even mean? Now, contemporary treatments of forgiveness in philosophy and ethics make a distinction between practical forgiveness and emotional forgiveness, or the practical and emotional aspect of forgiveness, sometimes called external and internal forgiveness, or short-term and long-term forgiveness. Turn the other cheek, so refraining from this knee-jerk revenge, is just the first step. The second step is committing to this long-term palliative care of your own resentment. This long-term forgiveness, dealing with the residual resentment in your own heart, is often more harder and sometimes almost insurmountable. But insofar as we can, he suggests we shouldn't aggravate the resentment. We should refuse to chew on the cud, so to speak. As a religious person, although he was an atheist for the first 35 years almost of his life, and almost became the professor of philosophy at Oxford, Lewis came to believe that prayer was sort of method or vehicle by which God supports people's own efforts to suppress and hopefully eventually to obliterate resentment in their heart. And because it was in the context of prayer that Lewis himself was able to forgive finally, probably his most unforgivable, difficult neighbor, talk about this soon, we must say something about prayer very shortly. Lewis believed that prayer is an effective but irksome weapon of enemy love. And it also is a part of Christian duty. And I quote, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Prayer is difficult, and Lewis wasn't sanctimonious. This is how he, as a Christian, describes prayer. Prayer is irksome. An excuse to omit is never unwelcome. We are reluctant to begin. We are delighted to finish. Prayer is real work, not some sort of fanciful castle building. And while the results were solely up to God, he thought it was our responsibility to pray and to pray sincerely. How do we do that? Well, first, we need to pray. This means setting aside time for it. The habit of prayer is another acquired virtue, and precisely because it's so irksome, it demands a sort of self-discipline. Remember that Lewis prayed every night for the people he was most tempted to hate. That's 365 days a year. He seems to have taken it quite seriously. Remember also the reason why he said that he had to do a good deal of thinking about it, because it was an effort to make his prayers real. In another wartime letter, he tells his friend, "The practical problem about love in our prayers is very hard work, isn't it? When you pray for Hitler and Stalin, them again, how do you actually teach yourself to make the prayer real?" Notice the when you pray, not if you pray. He assumes that his friend, a good Christian, is of course naturally busy praying for mass murderers, as one does. "Last week, while at prayer," Lewis writes elsewhere, "I suddenly discovered, or felt as if I did, that I had forgiven someone I had been trying to forgive for over 30 years. Oddly, though it had taken him decades, the final breakthrough had felt so easy, like learning to swim, which is difficult before you actually do it. And like floating, forgiving had consisted of stopping doing something. That is, resentment had not been just an emotion, but actually an act. Resentment had been doing something. It took over 30 years for Lewis to fully thaw this resentment, but he finally forgave the sadistic school principal of a boarding school which was inflicted upon him in childhood. This principal was eventually declared clinically insane, but not before he had managed to do quite a bit of damage. Well, I now turn to the second of my first question, which was about the dilemma of the soldier. War or violence in general is the ultimate test of enemy love. Are love and violence compatible? Can a soldier love his enemy? Can killing ever be an expression of love? As a survivor of First World War, Lewis had no time for sentimental glorification of battle. My memories of the last war haunted my dreams for years, he said. And when a new war, the Second World War, was imminent, the anxious Lewis said he wanted to hibernate and awake when the war was over. But actually, he wanted to die. I think death would be much better than to live through another war. And yet, he says to his friend, I'm not a pacifist. If it's gotta be, it's gotta be. Sometimes war was an odious necessity. And you may know that a pacifist, of course, is someone who refuses to bear arms in war. Lewis's most developed views on war and pacifism are included in a couple of essays that he wrote during the war, which were called Why I Am Not a Pacifist and The Necessity of Chivalry. And we don't need to rehearse any of it here. I mention only 2 points about killing in the New Testament, according to Lewis. First, the commandment, thou shalt not kill, is not a prohibition of all violence or even all killing. It's a prohibition of murder. It actually should be do not murder, which would make it clear. Second, Lewis takes Jesus' words about turning the other cheek, you remember, to be a prohibition of knee-jerk revenge. So when Jesus said, turn the other cheek, he meant what he said, but with an understood reservation in favor of those obviously exceptional cases which every hearer would naturally assume to be exceptions without being told. Does anyone suppose, Lewis asks a pacifist audience, so he's giving a lecture to a group of pacifists, that our Lord's hearers understood him to mean that if a homicidal maniac attempting to murder a third party tried to knock me out of the way, I must stand aside and let him get his victim? We must, of course, respect and tolerate pacifists, Lewis writes to a friend privately, but I think their views erroneous. Can violence or killing be described as love in any meaningful sense? My answer will be yes and no. War isn't fully compatible with love, but this means that it's somewhat compatible with it. It must be remembered that there are risks in both directions. There are risks involved when you do something, but there's also risks involved with when you do not do it. If war is ever lawful, then peace is sometimes wrong. Why so? Because nonviolence can sometimes be a failure to uphold justice in a world, in a messy world, motivated by rightly ordered love. And I understand that this is a strong argument that sometimes love prefers war to wrongful peace. But I think I personally agree with the sentiment. And I'm thinking about what one Oxford philosopher calls the evils, the tragedies, the ambiguities, risks, and uncertainties of peace. Such things as the preventable massacres and genocides that took place in Rwanda and Srebrenica in Bosnia. So I don't think that love categorically rejects violence. And by categorically, I mean always. I think that sometimes it can permit and even motivate it. I don't believe in what is sometimes called the virus of wishful thinking, the idea that everybody is rational and wants everyone's good. The fact of evil in the world and historical experience contradict this. And when people cannot be talked out of really terrible wrongdoing, sometimes they must be forced out of it. So I agree that war can be an expression of love, as this same Oxford philosopher says. Can. Isn't always, but can. But an expression of love towards whom? This is a much more difficult question. Violence can be an expression of self-love or family love against Lewis's homicidal maniac, someone who is trying to hurt you or hurt your loved ones. I think violence can be an expression of patriotic love as well, against a homicidal neighboring nation. And above all, I think it can be an expression of love for the innocent victim neighbor. Whether violence and war can be an expression of enemy love, so expression of love towards the enemy, is much more difficult, and which I'll address at the very end. We've all heard the maxim, or I assume you have, that all is fair in love and war. Now, I think this is doubly false. All is not fair in war. And it's precisely love that sets limits to war. Love may permit and even motivate war, but it also qualifies it. It sets serious limits to war. The guiding principle could be the so-called golden rule. Treat others as you would have them treat you. The literal interpretation of this is simplistic and actually impossible. For example, I love my back scratched. My brother hates it. Scratching his back is a declaration of war. The golden rule is actually just a guiding principle. It's not a mathematical formula. And applied to warfare, might go something like this. Wage war against others as you would have them wage war against you. Now, this both limits the reasons for entering, like justifiable reasons for entering war in the first place, and it curtails what can be done in war. Political theorists speak of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, justified reasons for going to war and justified methods in war, respectively. I said that it's doubly false, all is fair in love and war. Love limits war, but war, we must admit, imposes major limits on love too. War qualifies love. And this should be expected, given the qualification insofar as possible in my definition of love. Insofar as possible. War seriously limits the possibilities of love. War, and in fact all situations that require or call for violence, they compel us to use force, and sometimes even lethal force. I think that even in the best case scenario, even when our reasons for going to war are just and our methods in war are just, so even when we don't unnecessarily torture our enemies and we don't kill civilians and all that, even in the best case scenario, the soldier that kills the enemy is primarily motivated by love for others, not for love of the enemy, if at all. Now, this doesn't mean that the soldier can't or doesn't love the enemy at all. that he may. It means that he loves or she loves the enemy only insofar as they succeed in appreciatively and responsively committing to the enemy's well-being despite killing them. The good kill, if there is one, is the kill that least violates absolute love. Now, let me try to explain that. There's a sort of law of beneficence, which is written into human hearts and the order of things, which is based on a kind of absolute general law, a law to do good to everyone. And then to order your own loves and your own responsibilities in your life so that when you apply this absolute general law to do good to everyone in the changing circumstances of your life, which can be sometimes quite messy, conflicts of interest don't lead us to love in a disorderly way. That is, like, neglect higher loves at the expense of lower loves, or neglect higher duties at the expense of lower. This language of higher and lower reveals the hidden presupposition here that there's a sort of hierarchy of loves. So what could this order of love be? And how could we choose? How do we decide whom to love, and when there's a conflict of interest, whose demands, whose needs to put first? Lewis offers no clear-cut hierarchy or formula, just examples or rules that he thinks have never been doubted in human history. And these rules or obligations are based on values and intrinsic qualities like justice, patriotism, and even species. He says something like this: special responsibility is due to people to whom your beneficence is pledged by a promise, justice, or who have already benefited you, gratitude, or who are specially weak and pitiable, mercy, or fellow citizens, patriotism, or relatives, family affection. They are all perfectly sound, but the last two must not be allowed to override the others. So patriotism and family affection aren't always to be allowed to dominate and to decide where our loyalties lie. Sometimes, for example, this is how I read him here, sometimes our country may be telling us to do something in the name of patriotism that we ought not to do because of some other value, for example, mercy or justice. And so with this, we've arrived at the last hill, and I end with this. This is the hardest, steepest hill. I've been putting off the most difficult question until now. I tried to demonstrate how love for others can motivate violent and, in extreme cases, even lethal violence. But what about love for the enemy? How can we both love our enemy neighbor and kill him, if need be? Most pacifist thinkers say we cannot. On the contrary, loving enemies means not killing them. Can it ever be in our enemy's interest for us to kill him? Like, if we shoot him, can we imagine them turning towards us and saying with their last dying breath, "Thanks, I needed that. Thanks for contributing to my flourishing"? No. At least I can't think of persuasive or even remotely probable real-life examples of this. But I remain open to being corrected. In every or almost every case, the answer must be no. If it's good for my enemy to die by my hand in battle rather than to live another day and be united with their family, it's also good for me as his enemy to die by their hand instead of living another day and being united with my family. This seems absurd to me, and so I reject the premise. And this is where I have to disagree with really smart philosophers and ethicists who say that it is possible to love our enemies to death. I think it would be more correct to say that we can love others to our enemies' death. Please excuse a terribly morbid example, but rules are tested by extremes. Would I be willing to stop, say, a rapist in the very act of his crime by lethal force if it were the only way to stop him? I hesitate, but I'm afraid that I probably would. Would dying be better for him than to be allowed to finish his crime and to live another day? I cannot believe that it would. Not for him, anyway. I would, of course, hope that he might be cured in another world, perhaps, if there is an afterlife, but I wouldn't pretend to kill him for his own good. I agree that any moment of hesitation that might precede my act, any hope that the aggressor might stop before I pull the trigger, is a kind of love for him, but killing him is not. That's love for her. Killing is precisely that part in the act that makes our enemy love relative, not absolute. What I mean by this is that if we could find a circumstance where we didn't have to kill him, that would be better. But given the circumstances, this might be the greatest possible good at the moment. But I do not think that we love our enemies to death. I think this sort of language obscures the moral ambiguities and is, strictly speaking, false. We might love our enemies to the extent that killing them least violates absolute love. It's precisely their death that remains outside the full expression of love for them. What we say, in effect, is, I will kill you, but I won't torture you needlessly, and I wish you well hereafter. Relatively speaking, this isn't saying much, but it still might be the greatest possible good, better than the alternative. There are risks in both directions, you remember. The good soldier would like it better if no situation ever arose that demanded killing. If the soldier could choose a situation without such need, she would do it. So I do think love and killing can be compatible, but I'd say we may love enemies despite killing them, but the act of killing can in no meaningful way be called love for them. Sometimes war can qualify love almost beyond recognition. Enemy love is difficult but possible. Breakthroughs happen both in human relationships and also in war. It took over 30 years for Lewis to forgive his most unforgivable enemy, the sadistic principle, but he did it. And whether just or unjust, all wars end. Exactly 3 months after D-Day, Lewis wrote to his friend about how difficult it was to keep pace with the almost miraculous mercies we are receiving as a nation. He had never dreamt that the war would go quite so well. American and Soviet soldiers met on the Elbe River in April 1945. 5 days later, Hitler committed suicide. The next month, Germany surrendered unconditionally. the war in Europe was over. Lewis believed in some kind of heaven, but I'd like to respectfully suggest that if Lewis had indeed met that German soldier right after, simultaneously killing each other, they would not have laughed. Not at first, at least. Someday, perhaps, but not the first day. Rather, I imagine that they may have said something along these lines. I'm sorry historical circumstances didn't allow us to love each other better. I'm sorry that I couldn't love you more. Now that the war is over, however, let's make up for lost time and learn to love each other perfectly. By the way, have you seen Uncle Joe? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lepejärvi. I will. I've got my webcam back on. As I put in the chat, I had some Wi-Fi issues and had that off. Let me solicit for folks who'd like to ask a question. We do have a few minutes here, and I know that Dr. Lepejärvi is willing to answer them. I'll start us off, if I may, while we're waiting for stuff to show up. Dr. Lepejärvi, you talked a lot in the first half, or maybe even 2/3 of the talk, about you use a lot of distinctively religious language. Do you see the account of love you're giving as one that is open to everybody, regardless of what their broader religious views might be?
Absolutely. I don't think it has anything to do with religion. So when you define love as the appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing, I propose that as a universal definition of love that has nothing to do with religion. Religion or religious traditions might come into it. You might be able to draw from different religious traditions like Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, some resources, something that might make loving easier. Now, or more challenging, perhaps, like in this case. Now, in this case, I noticed that if you look at Christianity, I think it makes it even more difficult because there's this what Lewis called the terrible command to love your enemy. Now, why should we even think that we are under any obligation to love our enemy? Where does this come from? Well, apart from it being a religious duty, perhaps there might be other reasons, more practical or philosophical or ethical reasons why this might be so. And also this idea that forgiving someone, overcoming your resentment is a universal principle. There might be just terribly wonderful reasons why that might be valuable. I mentioned that sometimes resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die, that it's actually harming yourself. But the command to forgive somebody who has hurt you is a terrible command, especially if we think that forgiving someone means that we kind of have to learn to like them, or that it means that we condone the terrible thing they said, for example. These are questions that Truth and Reconciliation commissions all over the world, in South Africa and in Canada and in the US, have dealt with quite a bit this past century. So to summarize, I think the definition of love is universal. There's nothing specifically Christian about it.
Thank you. I saw Alison Kreiner's hand came up. Alison, do you have a question?
did. I couldn't. This talk it came at an opportune time for me. I'm actually doing some work with criminal defense, and finding some clients. It's difficult sometimes to rep, even though you owe this your duty to represent individuals sometimes. And I was just wondering, even though it was, not really in his wheelhouse, if Mr. Lewis's work has ever really been applied to criminal justice, criminal defense, things like that.
It has. Thank you, Alison. It has. And in fact, Lewis has published in law journals. I think it's called, if I remember correctly, one of his essays was called On Capital Punishment. And another essay was called The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment. And there's a couple of others as well. So, yes, although he himself was a literary scholar, he was primarily a philosopher. And when you're a philosopher, you know everything interests you, and you write about everything from A to Z. And if you're articulate enough, other people will pick up on it and then maybe use your material. So I do know that his essays and his work have been used in the study of law as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I see we've got two hands and a question in the chat. So if we can maybe sneak those in, we might go a minute or two beyond our allotted time. I suspect that I can talk Dr. Lepiardi into sticking around for 4 or 5 extra minutes. But I think we had Sean first, and then I think it was Bosun's comment in the chat, and then we'll close with Natalia's question, if that's okay. Sean, do you want to lead us off there?
So there are some other crimes people can commit besides killing. Like, people can steal from things. People can kind of like punch or slap someone. Could those actions also be shown as love, just in the way we would think of like murder?
Well, what I tried to say is that killing itself is not an expression of love towards the person being killed. So just to be clear on that, I don't think killing can in any meaningful way be described as an expression of love towards the person who is killed. And it's an expression of love to other people, perhaps, innocent third parties, or perhaps yourself or your family who are trying to be protected in extreme situations. And yet, I don't think that if you kill someone, it's always a failure of love towards that person who you killed. You didn't want to do it. The alternative was worse. If you, just for the delight of it, torture them before you kill them, now that's a failure of love. But if you refrain from unnecessary violence, insofar as you're able to refrain from them, you are actually expressing love, but you just can't express it as much as you can. Now, your question is a very good one, and I'd say yes. I'd say that this applies. This obviously can apply to less drastic forms of violence. You know, tripping someone who is chasing someone with the attempt of, you know, beating the crap out of them for no good reason, and you trip them and they break their jaw. Okay, you have used force and injured someone. And I don't think it's a failure of love necessarily. And, you know, obviously, all of these good examples of where it's not a failure of love, we can think of counter examples where it is a failure of love, like terrible examples of violence. But I believe it's ambivalent, and it's like context dependent. It depends on the context.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Boson, we've got you in the chat, and since it's in there, I can go ahead and read it. Boson asks, I can understand that enemy love is hard, but is achievable. What do you have to say to someone practicing enemy love? The enemy refuses the love, and in response continues the act of resentment.
So continues the act of resentment, the enemy continues, or you do?
It sounds like the enemy continues to go ahead.
Okay, the enemy's resentment is the enemy's resentment. Yours is yours. My definition of love was that love is the appreciative and responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing insofar as possible and permissible. And in this case, the beloved is the enemy. The qualification insofar as possible is crucial. And so it means that love is not an on-off button where you either love or you don't love. It's a spectrum. And you can succeed in loving them in one sense, in one dimension, but not in another. When you've done all you can, you've loved perfectly. If the enemy continues to try to injure you, enemy love doesn't mean naively exposing your heart to be shot at again and again and again, metaphorically speaking. It is prudent to protect yourself, protect your heart, or even protect your body, your person, if need be. So I'd keep these two things distinct, your resentment and the enemy's resentment.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just get it clear. So does that mean that the enemy love has to do with the person giving the love, and it's not coming from the enemy that is accepting it?
Bosun, precisely. The enemy love means the love that is offered to the enemy. The whole idea of enemy kind of presupposes that they aren't loving you. No, they're actively not loving you, right? In some way or another, instead of appreciatively and responsively committing to your well-being, they've done the opposite of that. And that's why they're enemies. Whether what they've done is emotionally injured you or physically injured you, you somehow have resentment towards them. And that's why it's so very hard to love them.
Thank you both for that. We've got Natalia, and then I wonder if we can get Dr. Lepayarvi in an act of love to stick around for one more question. If we can go to Natalia and then to Amiri. Natalia, you're next.
Hello. Good to see you, Dr. Lepayarvi.
Good to see you.
Yeah. I was curious of your thoughts on how this translates into love or hate, or maybe even perceived love and hate in the social media sphere. So the idea of, like, your definition of hatred being, what was it? The charm of shared grievance, which I thought was so interesting. But then you have social media where algorithms are designed to encourage and further the charm, the shared grievance, and to incentivize it. But then it also made me think of Benedict Anderson, where he talks about imagined communities and this sense of nationalism that is based off of an idea that we have constructed, like freedom. So what one person is saying, I'm dedicated to freedom, the definition of that could be different, and where maybe that gets has a different view in social media compared to if I'm walking down the street and I tripped someone. So I wondered your thoughts in that realm.
Dr. Jordan, Natalia here is another person that I've met in Oxford 10 years ago or 9 years ago. It is very good to see you. I sometimes call Twitter's business model a zoo of grievances. Twitter and other social media seem to base their business model on grievance, and so do some news agencies. They live off grievance, so they feed grievance because that's where they get their revenue, and that makes it very, very difficult for ordinary people. And you could say that if war imposes serious qualifications and limits and challenges on love, social media does that as well. But I propose that this definition of love is universally applicable, and it applies to social media as well. So just to rehearse, love is the appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing insofar as possible. And in order to be a good lover, you need all of the virtues, because even if you lack just one virtue, you will have kind of depleted your potential as a lover. Just imagine, somebody in a romantic relationship who is a great lover, except doesn't have the virtue of faithfulness. Now that's a terrible lover. Take away one virtue and you will have kind of dented your potential as a lover. Now, on social media, how do you appreciatively and responsively commit to each other's flourishing? Examples are endless, but I'll mention just one. Every now and then, quite often, people are attacked on social media, and a mob will swarm and try to get them fired and ruin their reputation, sometimes even ruin their livelihood. Usually, or not usually, but I'm thinking of the examples where the committed crime or wrong think or mistake or whatnot that person did is not the punishment isn't in proportion to the crime, right? And so when that happens, if you're that person's friend, say it's your friend, their flourishing, their well-being at that moment might require somebody to step up and defend them and to say, this is a good woman or this is a good man. And I don't believe it, and I'm standing with them. But if you do that, you put yourself into line of fire and you become vulnerable to loss of reputation or even livelihood. Only the courageous friend will be able to do that. If you don't have, in this case, the virtue of courage, you will not be in such a good position to love that friend, to commit to their flourishing as the friend who has courage. And so on. You could go through all of the virtues and see how these virtues somehow support love, even on social media.
Thank you. I see we got Professor LaPuma added one that he said can be addressed later. Maybe for those of us, some of us in the Mandel Scholars Academy are going to be meeting for a follow-up. But Amiri's hand is back up, and I think we essentially promised Amiri the last question here. So Amiri Rice. Amiri, you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, I had a few questions throughout, and they kind of got answered when you answered other people's questions. But I thought of just one more. How would you try to establish enemy love when you cannot either relate to your enemy's position, or you don't have any prior relationship with that enemy?
Amiri, a good and a very difficult question, but I'm going to need some more background, when you don't relate to them or you don't have any prior relation to that enemy. These were the two qualifications that you mentioned. When you don't relate to them, I would say that you don't relate to any of your enemies. That's kind of the problem. That's kind of why they are your enemies, because there's something unrelatable in their behavior. But what about the second one? When you have are you talking about someone you don't know personally, for example?
Yes. But you don't know them personally, or you just don't have a general idea of their belief system, or, what drives them to do certain actions.
No, that's a very good question and a very difficult one. Why are they your enemy?
In that instance, I probably wouldn't know.
Well, if we just like hypothesize,
If they're part of a selective group that you would deem your enemy, but you personally don't have any animosity towards them, but more the organization or establishment or group that they align in.
Well, my definition of enemy kind of assumed that either you feel resentment towards them, or they're trying to hurt you or have hurt you. Now, if neither one of these applies, if you don't have any animosity towards them or don't feel resentment towards them, and they're actively not trying to injure you, I wouldn't call them an enemy. But say they are somehow, because I did say that, you might find it difficult to love someone who is trying to hurt someone you love. Not necessarily you, but someone you love. And just look at that list of 6 people that C.S. Lewis prayed for every day. 3 of them were foreign dictators and 3 were university professors. Now, the foreign dictators obviously didn't know who Lewis was, but he still prayed for them and thought they were his enemy. And I think it's because they jeopardized and threatened values that Lewis felt that Lewis cared for, and people, right? They threatened Lewis's loved ones, stability in Europe, and as a Finn, if I may say, Soviet Union threatened Finland, because Lewis followed that war as well, and Finland was a small country, Soviet Union was a big country. He cared for Finland, and he was upset that Soviet Union would bully Finland. There, I wonder if this might be one way in which religious resources or religious traditions come into play, because it seemed like there was nothing much Lewis could do except pray. I mean, what do you do? How do you contribute to the flourishing, the well-being of people you do not know? Right? Maybe you can find remote ways to support them, or remember, love is a spectrum. It's not either you love perfectly or you don't love at all. Maybe your way of loving them is not like supporting them, but refraining from revenge or refraining from hurting them in your anger. That may be the first step in showing enemy love.
Okay.
It's a very good question, Amiri, and a very difficult one.
Okay. Yeah.
Excellent questions all. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. I'll note, Professor Lipumba, that I'm someone who's deeply interested in the philosophy of religion. So clearly what Dr. Lopayarvi has led us to is the need to now start debating whether or not there is a God, right? So we know what our next topic is. And I'm half kidding when I say that, but I do.
I would love to get in on that one.
So, sorry, my wife, I just cut out for a moment there, but no, I think part of what is magnificent about philosophy as a discipline is just how broad it is and how many questions of genuine importance and great interest are encompassed by it. So This was a really interesting presentation and discussion, Dr. Lepiarvi. Thank you so much. Everyone, thank our guest one more time. We'll call it a day.
Thank you. It was
Thank
a
you,
pleasure.
Professor.
Hopefully I get to return soon and see you all in person on campus one day.